Reformation in England or Scotland? Any reading or listening, Tim? All right, Kevin, Nico. All right, Ken. What stands out in your memory as you think about the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in England and Scotland? Great. So in Zoom land, Tim said that the Reformation in England was marked by being more political than the Reformation work in continental Europe, Germany, Switzerland. So that's true. We'll look. That's why we're going to have to spend a lot of time on politics today. All right. So we're going to do a lot of political background, which it's very significant, and it even bleeds over into much of what we have received and you're familiar with because we are Americans. So that's going to be relevant. Ken, what stands out? Did you raise your hand? All right. Nico? All right. So John Knox stands out to you. Yeah, pretty much if I could choose, we would just talk about John Knox, but we would not really learn about the Reformation. So we will touch on him, but we won't be able to dive as deep as I would prefer. So classic. I forgot to turn off my so yeah. That's a great question. So let's think 1492, what happened? Yeah, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So so my children, you can be able to think we're talking about the time period that Columbus and others were seeking to explore the whole world and set up new lands in the name of whatever king or country sent them. All right. So we're talking the beginning of the 16th century and really through maybe the middle part is where we're not going to get there, but through the middle part of the 17th century. So the 1500s and the 1600s. Right. So we're going to start in the early 1500s when we consider Scotland, but that's what we're talking about. So you could also think, when was the first British child born in the New World? Do you remember? Virginia Dare. I think it was earlier. I think it was before 1610. I could be wrong. Yeah, it was that was here in North Carolina. So we're talking about the century that precedes the New England experiment. All right. So what's that? Yeah, 1587. All right. So so these things are very, very relevant to understanding our nation and at least its beginning. So that's the period that we're talking about. Anything else before we dig in? We're going to have to go relatively fast, but we're covering it in a sort of skipping across the surface. Anything stand out as you just recall what you've heard? All right. We're not going to be talking about Puritans. So as you think about the Puritans, that's where we will get to maybe next week. That will be, you think about the 100 years of Puritanism is between like 1560 and 1650. All right. So those are really the 100 years of Puritans domination. We're going to talk about leading up to it, the end of Elizabeth's reign, which is the beginning of Puritanism in England. This is really fascinating. So, if you don't appreciate this, I understand, but I really like it. So thanks for letting me think about it, listen to lectures, read some books. That's all I am. So I am not an expert. You won't have to think very hard to ask a question that I will not know the answer to. So with those concessions, we're going to dig in. Tim has already mentioned that the Reformation in England is different from the Reformation in continental Europe, Germany, Saxony. We're thinking about those those cantons of Switzerland. We've talked about Zurich. We've talked about Bern. We've talked about Geneva. What made the Protestant Reformation different in England from what has taken place in continental Europe is that there is no key reformational figure that dominates whether it's the cultural landscape or the political landscape like there was, especially in Martin Luther. Now that's going to change when you think about John Knox in Scotland, but when you're thinking about England, you don't have a figure like Luther, this kind of one single individual that is able to do things and unite things and oppose things with the power that Martin Luther had. John Calvin emerged to that, as you remember, with the execution of Servetus. Then Calvin was sort of seen as this great hero in continental Europe. But in England, there is no figure like that. Secondly, as Tim has mentioned, it was first a political move by Henry VIII for a number of reasons. It wasn't essentially a reform of the theology of the church. So I would say it's really a different species when you're talking about what took place in England, which is going to be very, very helpful when you're just trying to understand like your brothers and sisters in Christ who are actually Anglican. Like I cannot wrap my head around it, right? But understanding what took place in the English Reformation at least is going to give you intellectual information to say, okay, at least I know why you are the way you are, even though I totally can't understand why would you do that. But it's a different species of Reformation than what we see advocated in the Continental Reformers, especially Calvin and Zwingli. Number three, it is very diverse because of the different influences, the different directions, the different theologies, the different players that all converge in this single nation that had at its surface a Protestant church. So we've talked about immigration. You remember Geneva and the significance of immigration because all the Roman Catholics were driven out. There's a vacuum. You need workers, you need scholars. And so they came from a lot of places, especially France. And so in that sense, what's going to happen in England is there's a period where people from England go to continental Europe and they study there, and then they come back, but they've been influenced by different reformers. Zwingli is going to have a significant role. Calvin has a significant role. Luther has a role, but not as significant as those two. So that creates differences. They don't have the same vision. They've seen something different. They may have a different view of the Lord's Supper. So this creates a lot of competition. And when you have a lot of ideas, a lot of differences, and a lot of competition, you're not going to have that kind of force that you had with Luther or even with Calvin in Geneva. So that's the third reason. The Continental Reform is what we've been talking about, and it was regional. Do you remember? We've tried to get our heads around the way that society and countries were ordered, and it was really this growing nationalistic passion, but it hadn't really taken shape yet. But it was featured. So Luther was a German, and thus he was very effective with German speakers. Right? They would read him in other languages, but his real emphasis was he captured the German people. Likewise, with Calvin, we were able to see he was effective, but there was tension because the Genevan people thought, well, you're just sort of getting your French cronies to have power. So we do see that the Reformation in continental Europe was more centered language, like language centers in these little cities. And so it wasn't this nationwide kind of Reformation that is going to take place in England. Another thing that marks continental reform is that there was many political powers and competition sort of at the state level. You're not going to have that in England. You have a monarchy. They rule. So you don't have these political figures that kind of neutralize the power of the other states and the other state rulers. And so that creates for a different kind of reform. And so these factors all go into making the distinctions between the Reformation in England and what took place on the continent. The dominant idea that is significant, that has taken root with many folk, especially the noble classes, is that the state should be over the church. Now, this seems incredibly strange to modern Americans. At least it seems strange to me. But if you would consider who was the ruler over the empire as the Roman Empire began, it crumbled, and you have these other not nations, but powers or states or entities. Who was the single world ruler, as you maybe can recall some of the church history lectures? Who is the greatest single ruler over all of these peoples and places? The Pope. All right, the Pope. So in that sense, we're coming into the 16th century, and it has been the Pope who has been the dominant leader over all of these nations. And so at this point, they're not liking that. And so the idea is now, like, it seems like the state should be the ruler or head over the church. And so whether we agree with it or not, hopefully you don't agree with it, but that's not the dominant view. Now there is this attraction for the state to be over the church in the 16th century. And so this begins to help us understand, why does what happened in England, why does it take traction? Why would noble people allow for this? At least quite a number of them. Why would they let this happen? And so this is because this idea has taken root in quite a number of the noble classes, the people who had power. When Cranmer is ultimately declared to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, when King Henry VIII becomes the head of not only the state as the King of England, but also the head of the church, we're going to see this kind of compromise that's principled. And part of the thing that we have to understand, that it's strange for us, is that Cranmer views the state as having a rightful authority over the church. The politics of the state and the polity or the government of the church only had a category at this point of sort of being top down. And so we'll see this emergence of thinking about a national church, and we'll see that eventually Knox establishes the precursor to Presbyterianism, which does have elders that are selected and ministers that are approved and tested. But you still need to understand that the assumption is that it will be top down. Politically, we need to understand a number of differences between Scotland and England for us to understand the dynamic that's going to emerge. Prior to the 16th century, the historic ally of Scotland is what country? Think about, what are the two different ways that you spell Stewart? Right, here's one, Stewart. There's another one. Do you know how the other? All right. Where do you think they got that spelling from? All right. True, but why do they spell it that way? What language might that sound like? I'll go ahead and tell you. The French. All right. So there is an association already established. The traditional ally to Scotland are the French. You may remember that the French have been ardently Catholic, at least the leaders have been. And so when you think of Scotland coming into the 16th century, you need to think of allies of the French who have been loyal to the Catholic nation. Their arch nemesis is England to the south. Now, there's reason for that, and that's because England has invaded into Scotland and have sought to conquer them. So they've definitely got some bad relationships in their history. But when you're coming into the 16th century, that's the traditional ally France and enemy England. So when things are going to change, we need to see that the relationship of Catholicism and Protestantism is already going to have sort of political, you're importing in your old enemies and allies into Catholicism and Protestantism. So for us, we need to understand we're not talking about a pure reform of the church that is simply just what does the Bible say and what should we do. It's got these traditional allies and enemies. It has like, what side do you want to rule in your nation? And so what takes place in the 16th century is Scotland is beginning to rethink, should we not be allied with France, but rather be allied with England? And there's those two parties within Scotland. So the Anglophiles, that's who they love, the British, and the Francophiles, they love the French. Those are your two parties in Scotland as we enter into the 16th century. Likewise, when King Henry VII, so that's not the King Henry VIII who's going to dominate most of our talk, but when King Henry VII, he has his son Arthur to marry Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. That Spain was Britain's ally historically at the time. Catherine of Aragon is 15 years old, and Arthur dies 4 months after they marry. So when they married, you had the King of England marry a significant noble Spanish princess, is because you want to make sure that your allies, that they're married into you, right? In-laws they may have to fight with you. All right. So that's the general strategy. Well, then when Arthur dies, King Henry VII decides that his younger son, who is Henry VIII, is going to marry his brother's widow. Here's the problem. Roman Catholic canon law says you can't do that, but he does it. Right. So we already can see, where's the conflict now between the Roman Catholic Church and the King of England, right? What does the King of England have in mind as sort of like his chief goal? Just generally speaking, you don't know anything about. Yeah, he's looking out for his kingdom and his reign, right? So this creates the problem that is now going to center on Henry VIII and the authority of the Pope. Well, they do what was normally done when you disobey the Roman Catholic authorities and you do something that they say is unlawful. You ask for the Pope to say that's okay. And so they ask for a papal dispensation, and he gives them the papal dispensation, which basically say it's okay. Your marriage is legitimate. And so as soon as Henry was old enough to legally marry his older brother's widow, they are married. The marriage now is this is the fabled marriage of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, the Spaniard, the Catholic. Their marriage is doubted from the beginning. Why was it doubted? That's right. So this is relevant. You can't hear that on Zoom land, but Tim said that it's calling into question the Pope's authority to cancel church law. So this is a crisis, not only that Protestant reformers raised because they're reading their Bibles now and saying, what is this? This is a practically exposed problem. Can popes declare church law not binding? Does he have that kind of authority? Right. So this is this emerges through their marriage. And so people doubt whether this marriage is legitimate. Now, this is absolutely strange to Americans today, to Christians today, but what is a consequence of an unlawful marriage? You may not even have the category anymore. Illegitimate children. If you are a noble person, especially a king and a queen, and your marriage is illegitimate, then the fruits of the womb from that marriage are not legitimate children. They're illegitimate children, and they have no rightful, uncontested claim to the throne. So you can see this is a big deal, right? And this is sort of the edge of the spear that's going to drive the decision for England to break from the Roman Catholic Church. In addition to this question of authority about the Pope and church law and whether this is a legitimate marriage, they are not happy. All right, so it doesn't seem that this marriage really was what they had thought it might be. In addition to an unhappy marriage that is questionable, it also doesn't produce a son. There is no male heir to the throne of England. They did have, what's that? It does produce a female heir, Mary Tudor. We will talk quite a bit about her. And but in the absence of a son and the doubt of legitimacy of the marriage, it is now judged by many to be a marriage judged by God. Now, there's another political reason why they do not want a marriage of their monarch to not produce a clear heir to the throne. And that is if there is a debate over who is the rightful heir, then there's going to be a bloodbath fighting over the throne, which had just happened, and they did not want that to happen again. And so there was a lot of reasons that people called into question this marriage, and ultimately they sought for a solution. One solution suggested by King Henry VIII was that he could have the son that he's already conceived out of wedlock, the Duke of Richmond, to be declared legitimate. That was his initial solution, but this would ultimately not be an uncontested heir, so that was not the solution. Another political solution would set Spain against England, and that didn't seem to be wise because the French and Scotland would be breathing down their necks, and they wouldn't have the backup of Spain. Ultimately, the Pope would have to make that action. He'd have to declare the illegitimate son to be legitimate, and then that would set Spain against Rome. So you could see, like, there's a lot of pieces that go into this particular pie. And one cardinal suggested that Henry's illegitimate son marry Henry's legitimate daughter. So that was a potential solution. Henry didn't think this was a solution. It would only compound the problem, so he didn't agree to that. Ultimately, they were able to get the Pope to annul the marriage. The way that they were able to do this is that they sought the canon of British law, which said it was illegal to ask the Pope for advice. Then they turned to the academies, the seminaries, the universities and said, was this a lawful marriage? Was my marriage to Catherine of Aragon, my older brother's widow, was this lawful? And the academics said, no, it wasn't, right? So they were able to bring about the annulling that marriage. Now, what's the consequence on Mary Tudor? Your mother and your father's marriage is declared illegitimate. What then are you? You're illegitimate, right? So that's how Mary of Tudor ends her time in England. That's going to be important when she returns to the scene. Kevin.
The Pope refused to annul because he was in love with the money coming from the
Yeah, the Pope did.
He refused to annul it.
He refused to do it, but what they did instead is they were able to work around with the British law
And that,
and the sort of academic hub, which was willing to say no, it was not a lawful marriage.
this starts a split between England and the Roman Catholic Church. That's where Cranmer is set over the Church of England. He becomes equivalent to a pope for England.
That's right. So Cranmer, Thomas Cranmer, who was at the time Henry VIII's advisor on church matters, he was the one who suggested that they go to the universities and see what do the scholars say, which that's always an in run, just in case you're wondering it. All right. So if people are like, I don't know what the pastors are saying, let's go to the seminaries. You're like, oh, I remember this play. All right. So there's one lesson. All right. So they go to the seminaries and see what the seminaries say. And so their judgment is that it's invalid. So Henry VIII is, he uses these ancient laws, he uses the seminaries. And so they now disavow their submission to the Roman Catholic Church and to the Pope. But he leverages some power to the Pope. And that is that the clergy in England will be under the king. All right. The Pope is sort of worked into the situation that he has to declare Cranmer the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so all of this has nothing at all to do with the Protestant Reformation. Right? There's not a bone in Henry's body that reverberates with the Protestant Reformation. It is political. It's all political, right? Cranmer, however, is going to have quite a bit of change, and he is going to see this as an opportunity to make some reform and to bring in Protestant theology into the Church of England. Henry already by this time had written and published a treatise against Luther and his doctrine, which the previous Pope Leo X declared Henry to be a defender of the faith for what he wrote. Now, remember Henry's moral life. I've read from the same 2-volume history, Justo Gonzalez's The Story of Christianity. And Justo Gonzalez summarizes King Henry as being essentially conservative. And it seems like, I mean, that only refers to his views of traditional church doctrine. That means that Henry was, if anything, just a Roman Catholic who ultimately, for political decisions, breaks from Roman Catholic authority. Right? So when we're talking about the formation of the Anglican Church in 1534, when England broke with Rome, when Parliament legislated prohibitions for payments to be sent to Rome, you're not talking about any real Protestant Reformation. You're only talking about a political decision to break from Rome. Now, Parliament made these orders because the king told Parliament to. In addition, Parliament declared Henry's marriage to Catherine illegitimate, and they also declared Mary Tudor not heir to the English throne, and the King of England to be head of the church. So if one denied the king to be head of the church, what are you guilty of? Treason. Talk about a recipe of disaster. All right. So if you're ever wondering what brought about the notions that would spawn the United States of America, you're looking at a recipe that would cause you to wonder, maybe we should separate the church and state. All right. So that's what took place in 1534. Any questions thus far? There were, however, influences of Protestant Reformation in England before 1534. Can you remember the preacher who predated Luther's writings? Was there a question?
I had to answer out there with Tyndale.
All right. So Tyndale's coming. Do you remember the one who preceded him? Wycliffe. All right. Wycliffe had this group of preacher called Lollards. And so they were sent out and they were preaching. They were preaching in the English tongue to the common people. In addition, they also had the disciples of John Hussite. So England had, prior to 1534, these preachers to the common people, which had whet their appetite for a real reform to the church, a doctrinal reform, an ethical reform. In addition to that, Luther's writings had been circulated through England, because when did he nail the 95 Theses? What year? 1517. We're talking about 1534. So Luther has really done a lot of work by this time. His works have been translated into English. They're being, I don't know if that's true. They would be read in Latin, but I need to take that back. They were reading Luther in England. In addition, those from England who went to the continent to study in the universities were giving the humanistic education that we've talked about in some way being the seedbed for the questions and going back to the original sources of the New Testament, wanting also to study the Old Testament in Hebrew. And so all of this was taking place, but it was especially common among the nobles' children for these kinds of questions that would beget Protestant doctrine and the Reformation of the churches that were taking place. It was in the nobles' children through their education. That is a historical lesson. Generational change is especially affected by education. By education. That is definitely true for the Protestant Reformation. Well, not all in England agreed with what took place in 1534, that the king was head of the state and the church. Most notably is Sir Thomas More. He was a nobleman, and he opposed this ultimately at the expense of his own life. There is some good things to say, though. Thomas More's daughter, he had a number of daughters. One of his daughters came to him when he was imprisoned for treason, because he disagreed with the king's decision as well as with what Parliament had done. And his daughter gave him a number of noble people who said, this is okay. And Thomas More said, I never intended to pin my conscience to another man's back. Now, part of the reason I'm going to give a number of quotes from figures is because these individuals, even though Thomas More was a Roman Catholic, he actually was canonized as a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. All right, you need to understand something about the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation would have never taken place to any degree if individuals were not committed to living according to their conscience under the Word of God. So in the same way that Martin Luther was able to do what he did because he would not yield his conscience over to an authority greater than Scripture, so did other people, including Sir Thomas More. Right? So we can talk about Protestant doctrines all day long, but so long as individuals are not interested in surrendering to the lordship of Jesus, delegated in his word, no one will do anything courageous. And so that's one of the lessons that we actually learn. Now, I think John Knox is one of the most courageous, if not the most courageous man out of all the reformers, because that's the way he lived. To his pain and pragmatic success, he tended to live that way. But we won't get there. But that's a particular point. Now, Thomas Cranmer, I have a very uncomfortable relationship with Thomas Cranmer, as I've seen what he did in history. And yet, if you've read the Common Book of Prayer, it is incredibly rich. And he is the main contributor for the Common Book of Prayer. But Thomas Cranmer is declared to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he is, in one sense, the the church head under King Henry VIII. He sees this break with Rome to be an opportunity to reform the church. So he supports the king's policies, thinking that these are going to be a pragmatic opportunity for more significant change within the church. I do want you just historically to consider you have a Cranmer-like approach on one hand and a John Knox approach on the other hand. Now, I'm going to advocate that you take Knox's approach because I think you live with a clean conscience before God, surrendered to the word of God as you understand it. But Cranmer, he's sort of the politician. He ends up getting burned anyway. But so I'm going to say you're going to die anyway. So if you're going to choose one or the other, go with Knox. But I do want you to see that there's other figures and there's tension in how to navigate this. But those are sort of the two poles for you to maybe go back into church history and read about and to consider. But Thomas Cranmer takes this approach. Henry is, we're going to have to come to the end of Henry, but Henry is described by Justo Gonzalez as essentially conservative on religious matters, and he seemed to have been a firm believer in the most traditional teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. Henry's concerns are political and personal. They are not spiritual. They are not fundamentally the reform of the church. Henry, as the head of the church, declares his marriage to Anne Boleyn, whom he already secretly married. He declares it to be valid. Really convenient if you happen to be the head of the church and are having affairs with other women. Right? So he declares his marriage to Anne Boleyn to be a legitimate marriage. Anne Boleyn doesn't give him a male heir. She does give him another daughter, Elizabeth, another key player that's going to emerge onto the scene. Anne Boleyn, however, is accused of adultery. She's condemned to death and executed. Difficult days to be a wife. All right. If you're married to the king and he's just done with you, your head's coming off or you're burnt. All right. So Anne Boleyn is executed, but just think, this is also helpful. Just think Elizabeth, her daughter, grows up with her mother having been executed. That's just interesting. I have no other comments. You'll see what she ends up doing. Henry then marries Jane Seymour, who finally gives him a male heir to the throne. Jane dies, and Henry marries Anne Cleves, sister-in-law to the Protestant prince of John Frederick of Saxony. I'm sure Peter is related to this man. All right, but this is a political move. Henry was trying to make an alliance with the German Lutherans that would be able to help England because he's feeling pressure from the French and having questions about Spain. But what do you think the Lutherans are going to want from Henry, the head of the Church of England? Lutheran doctrine. So they think, hey, your doctrine is going to need to articulate some of our Lutheran positions. And so at this point, what do you think Henry does? Divorces his wife. All right. So it's inconvenient for Henry. So he divorces his wife. He now marries his fifth wife, Catherine, common name. Maybe he just needed to make sure they had the same name. Catherine Howard. She was a committed Roman Catholic, and she influenced Henry to be against any Reformation. And so you'll see the women behind the king influence their posture toward the Reformation. So Catherine Howard is, while she's in Henry's good graces, it doesn't go so well for the reformers in the Church of England. But conveniently, she falls out of Henry's favor. She is disgraced and she is beheaded. Following Catherine Howard is Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, P-A-R-R, and she was a support of the reform of the church in England. And so she influences Henry to be more favorable to church reform until his death in 1547. So it's under this king, Henry VIII, that the head of the Church of England becomes the crown, and reformational ideas are somewhat smuggled in to certain doctrines, especially in the Book of Common Prayer. It's also during this time, under this king, that the Bible is translated into English and put in every church in England, such that anyone could walk into the church, go to the pulpit that was chained to it, and read it under this king. It is under this king that conditions became favorable for Protestant Reformation doctrines to enter and gain traction to the English-speaking people. So Edward, the only son of Henry, takes the throne at his death. Edward is a sickly young man, and he reigns for 6 years. Both the first 3 years, he's really overseen by Duke of Somerset, who I believe is an illegitimate child of Henry. And then the other 3 years, he's overseen by another man. The Duke of Somerset was a favor for the Reformation, and he advanced the Reformation in England. Here's a few things that happened under Edward's first 3 years. The congregation in worship in the Church of England now drinks from the cup in communion. All right, so one thing that's helpful is to realize how far off the church was prior to the Reformation. So if you were coming to worship, you would not, they would call you laity, you would not receive the cup of the new covenant in Christ's blood, which he commanded his disciples to take. You wouldn't receive it. The priest would receive it. Well, under the Reform in Edward's first 3 years, now the people are able to drink from the cup. Another thing that took place is the clergy were allowed to marry. So priests in the Anglican Church can marry. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but that's a really big deal. Another change that took place is images are removed from the churches. Images are removed from the churches. The Book of Common Prayer now gives the English people a liturgy in worship in English shaped by Protestant theology. That alone is the most significant contribution to English-speaking people during the beginning Reformation in England. Just imagine worship up to this point is not in a language that you understand. It's a man saying things in another language that you can't even understand, that you would eat the bread and then he'd pray over you and then you would leave. Now the liturgy is in your tongue. And one thing Cranmer could do far better than the Presbyterians is he was beautiful with his English. So read the Common Book of Prayer and then go read the Westminster Confession of Faith. You probably don't want the Westminster Confession of Faith being read at your funeral, but you probably would prefer something from the Common Book of Prayer. Why is that? The way it sounds. Right? Cranmer, that's Cranmer's major contribution, which is a big deal. You're smuggling in one sense, Protestant theology through liturgy. That's what took place. Now, the last year of King Edward's reign was overseen by the Duke of Northumberland. They revised the Book of Common Prayer, and they publish it with more Zwinglian ideas about worship and communion. Let me give you a statement from the first one and then from the second one. This will also come into play when Elizabeth is queen. In the first edition, the instruction about taking the bread at the Lord's Supper reads, "The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life." Well, they change it. This is in the the last 3 years of Edward's reign. It was changed to this: "Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. Now, that may not sound significant to you, but the significance is the first rendering is it would be acceptable for a Roman Catholic view of the elements or a Lutheran view of the elements. The second edition is indicating a Zwinglian view, or maybe at most a Calvin spiritual view of the elements, so that now you partake of these elements with faith. All right. So that's people died over that difference. All right. So they are able to bring that in. Edward, however, dies. All right. Edward dies. And Mary Tudor takes the throne. So who's Mary Tudor's mama? Catherine of Aragon. Right. And she was very Catholic, and she did not like that England was not under Rome and the Pope. So she sets out to submit England to Roman Catholicism and to be under Rome. Her experience with her mother and her own dishonor as an illegitimate child forged this commitment to restore Roman Catholicism to England. The enemies of Henry, who had left, the Roman Catholic bishops who were disposed by Henry, now return, and they seek to support Mary Tudor. She, however, was a political disaster. She married her cousin, Philip, which if you are like, what would happen, let's just say right now, if for some reason our president decides to marry Vladimir Putin's daughter, like you would begin to go like, whoa, what in the world? Right? Like we would not like that. Right. So that's more or less what she does in marrying her cousin Philip. All right. It doesn't endear the English people to her. She does all kinds of mistakes like this. All right. So she tries to do it to consolidate her political support. All right. When she feels as if she's established her place in the throne, she now unleashes her persecution of Protestants. In 1554, England returns to obedience to the Pope. She undoes everything that had been done under Henry and Edward. The church calendar is restored to the Roman Catholic calendar by law, so that now if you disobeyed the Roman Catholic Church calendar, you're disobeying the law of England. What does that do? When you unite civil law over religious law, what happens when you break religious law? You break civil law. And what are people able to do if you break civil law? Use the state to punish you. All right. Just remember, these plays have been run before. All right. They're going to be run again. So she's able to do that, all of which enables the teeth of the state to be, engaged against the Protestants. Political persecution of Protestants is unleashed, and she burns almost 300 Protestants, imprisons hundreds of others, and exiles hundreds more. And for this reason, she is known as Bloody Mary. Right? Thomas Cranmer was one of the martyrs under Mary Tudor's rule. Cranmer was forced to watch two of his compatriots, Latimer and Ridley, both Anglicans, by the way, Protestant Anglicans. They were burned at the stake. There's a great saying between the two of them. They're being tied to the pyre, all right, that pole where they lit the flame, right? And help me if you remember, I think it's Latimer says to Ridley something like, come on now, Ridley, it is time for us to play the man. All right. Meaning they had been appointed to be martyrs, to bear witness to Christ in this way. And so they were courageous. Well, guess what Mary made sure Cranmer saw? Latimer and Ridley being burned. He was made to watch them to be burned from the window of his cell, because she did not want Cranmer to just die. She wanted Cranmer to recant. And so Cranmer signs the papers of his recantation after seeing Latimer and Ridley burned. Yet he was still forced to his own death. His execution was made public because he was made to now publicly recant. So she takes him, or has him taken, to the Church of St. Mary, where he's now given a public opportunity to state his recantation, because Mary is trying to crush the Protestants. Well, Cranmer, who had already signed the papers of his recantation, now at this opportunity before his death, after the sermon, before his execution, says this: "My papers of recantation were written contrary to the truth which I thought in my heart, and written for the fear of death, to save my life, if it might be. And for as much as I have written many things contrary to what I believe in my heart, my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall be burned. As for the Pope, I refuse him, for Christ's enemy and Antichrist, with all his false doctrines." And then Cranmer sticks his hand out to be singed by the fire before his body is to be burned. Protestants saw this. So here's the political mistake. She takes Cranmer and Ridley and Latimer and Ridley and all the other martyrs. She wants them to be burned and executed in front of Protestants. She thinks that will crush them. But what do you think it would do? It compels them. All right. So it backfires on her, having Cranmer this opportunity to recant in public, and instead he recants his recantation and courageously singes his own hand before he is burned. And so the Protestants embrace Cranmer as a hero for the Protestant cause in England because of the faithfulness at the end of his life. His execution fueled the Protestant resistance, and so Mary's efforts, ultimately, they don't succeed as severe as they were. Conveniently, God kills her in 1558. And her half-sister, Elizabeth, who's Elizabeth's mama? Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded. I mean, just imagine, you are a queen who has to be able to operate all that's required as a queen, knowing that your mother was beheaded, right? So we wonder, like, what makes people to do the things that they did and be so tough? Well, they sure had to live lives that I never had to live. All right. Anyway, that is Elizabeth. She now takes the throne. Upon her coronation, Protestant exiles returned from continental Europe. They were refugees, and they had been in Geneva and Zurich and Wittenberg because they see Elizabeth as an opportunity for now Protestantism to really take root in England. As fast as Mary Tudor undid all the changes of King Henry and Edward, so Elizabeth undoes Mary Tudor's Romish allegiances and practices. Protestantism was a conviction of Elizabeth, but also as a political necessity. Who was she against? She's following a Roman Catholic tyrannical queen. Do you think it would be a politically smart move to remain Roman Catholic? No, it would not be. All right. So there's political ends, but it seems as if she is a favorable monarch for the Protestant cause. And Rome offers to Elizabeth and endorse, if she will endorse and be under Rome, then Rome will endorse her. She doesn't even tell the Pope when she takes the throne. I think that does say a little bit about her. She was clearly an opportunity for Protestantism to advance. But she wasn't an extremist. One way that you can see that, she has the Book of Common Prayer redone, and she combines both the first wording that I read to you and the second wording, which means that you can have the Roman Catholic view, the Lutheran view when you come to the table, but then you also have the Zwinglian view. And that's a good window into what was Elizabeth like. She didn't want extremism within the Church of England. The Church of England, in one sense, was a house that all could somehow figure out their way. This is the key for me that helps me to understand Anglicanism. Like, I can't wrap my head around a view of the church that has the monarch of England as the head of the church. And if you know anything about Anglicans, there's basically like Roman Catholics within the Church of England, and they just call themselves Anglicans. But then you can have incredibly evangelical Protestant Reformed Anglicans, as in parts of Australia around the Diocese of Sydney, as well as what takes place in the Anglican Church on the African continent. All right, there's so many extremes. Even the American Episcopal Church is a part of the Anglican communion, and they deny, the resurrection and the virgin birth. Right? How do all of those fit in the so-called the Anglican communion? I can't understand it. But the reason, and somewhat, it was designed that way. And Elizabeth, I think, is a significant architect for how you might be able to intellectually comprehend this Anglican church. Elizabeth did not have a place for extreme Protestantism nor Roman Catholicism. It was sort of a house for all of them. But she does have an enemy, Mary Stewart. All right, Mary Stewart. Mary Stewart is her cousin. And she is, in one sense, like a sworn enemy of Elizabeth sitting on the throne. Elizabeth is opposed by Mary Stewart, who is claiming to be the legitimate Queen of England, and seeks to work resistance and to overthrow Elizabeth's reign. But her conspiracy against Elizabeth has her kicked out. So she actually orders that Mary Stewart be executed, but she ultimately escapes. It's notable that we do have to recognize Queen Elizabeth ordered about 300 souls to be executed during her reign. So if you were a Catholic, it didn't mean that things went well for you under Elizabeth. It is, however, she reigned 10 times longer than Bloody Mary. So you can see how bloody Mary's short reign was. Elizabeth did, however, allow for Catholic practice to occur privately in England if you were still pledged your allegiance to the crown and not to the Pope. And it's at the end of Elizabeth's reign that Puritans emerge in England, calling for the purifying of the Church of England. All right, so that's where we are. Any questions thus far? If you're ever wondering if you're having problems sleeping at night, you can just sort of maybe get the audio of this, and it does wonders to put people to sleep. Let me find it. Mary Stewart is because she's going to reign. She is James V's daughter. She is going to be the Queen of Scotland, and she's given the throne of Scotland in 1542. She's going to definitely be a player. All right. When we get into the stories about John Knox, Who can remember John Knox arguing with a queen, preaching to a queen, making a queen cry? Does anybody remember stories about that? Right, that's Mary Stewart. All right, you're going to hear, like, they do movies about Mary Stewart, and the way that people spin Mary Stewart today is like, the barbaric preacher Knox beats up on this pretty young, innocent, naive Queen Mary of Stewart. That is not Mary of Stewart. She was sharp. She was intelligent. She was shrewd. She had her husband blown up. All right. And then marries the man who blows up her husband. All right. This ain't no choir girl. All right. So that's Mary Stewart. But maybe we should wait till next week to get into the church Reformation in Scotland. All right. This is just the beginning. This is sort of, in one sense, setting the frame for Puritans. That's really where I thought we would go next. Do you want to hear the church in Scotland? Or do you want to skip over that and just go to Puritans, which consist of English and Scottish? All right. So we'll go into Scotland next week. Any questions from Zoom land? Okay. All right. So I have a question for you. Thus far, when you're just compiling your memories from the Reformation of the church in Germany and in Geneva, in Zurich, and now in England, is your church more reformed than their church? And if so, why? If not, why not? If you have duties if you need to walk out, please feel. It's a real question.
Yeah, yes, we're more reformed.
Why? All right, let me let John, and then Kevin, you throw yours in. Thank you, Thomases, for coming today. Love you.
Freedom of the individual. So like it seems like salvation isn't institutionalized at all in our church. So like salvation is an individual thing. You become one at a time. And I would say that our baptism is more reformed, where it's not, it's based on what the Bible says. We baptize believers. That's what's clear in the Bible.
Kevin.
I'm sorry. No problem.
Starting with Wittenberg and Bill, they're peeling off the layers of the Roman Catholic Church to become reformed. We are reformed because we are the fruits of their labor, starting with reading the Bible and interpreting it correctly, rather than having interpreted and then trying to change the church.
Anybody else want to weigh in? I think the question's helpful because one of the things that churches who do embrace their Protestant heritage and the Reformation, and they look to individuals like this and study just what took place in the Reformation, is one, we can think that they got everything right in the historic Reformation of the Protestant church. The other could be is we think that there's nothing we can learn from them. Those are two, I think, mistakes that we can make as we consider the Protestant Reformation and the churches therein. I would say I think we are in one sense more reformed. That is, if there is a recovery and the application of what the Bible teaches. I think that reveals that I think the American division between church and state is more consistent with what the Bible teaches than the union of church and state that they dealt with in all three of these contexts. The other would be, and we'll get into this when we look at Knox. We saw this in Calvin, but when you look at what they expected of their ministers, their pastors, and their preachers, I think we might need to recover some of what they had. I think when you look at least at what is expected and applied in our members, we have been able to do some things pertaining to church discipline that they really struggled to do, in part because of the difficulties with a church-state relationship that we do not have. So I think it's helpful just to be able to see, like, praise God, look at what we're able to do. Like, no one was really yet threatening your life if you came to church tonight and we read the Bible in our mother tongue. At the same time, I think the men who were leaders, as well as a number of the women, I mean, these are courageous people. And so they had to have some really special inner character to do what they did. So I think some of that we'll see. I'll try to pull out, especially with Knox. There's some good quotes. So we'll continue. With that, I'm going to dismiss us, close in prayer. Dear God, we do